What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Nerdy Professor Podcast, where we talk about everything black, bold, and beautiful. I am your host, the Nerdy Professor. This is a new year and a new beginning. Yay! And in this season, we're going to focus on the northernmost black folks of the American continent. That's right, y'all. We're moving to Canada. No pun intended, without the U.S. election win. In today's episode, we're going to discuss the beginnings of colonization and black people in the Great White North. This is a part of black history I feel is largely overlooked. While much of the world's focus on colonization and slavery has been centered around the United States, the brutal reality is that slavery was also deeply entrenched in early Canadian society. How could anybody think, with both Britain and France practicing slavery, that it wouldn't be in their colonies? Canada, long before it became a nation, was a site of enslavement where both indigenous people and Africans were stripped of their humanity and bound to forced labor. Imagine being a young child, ripped from your home and thrown into some bizarre land across the ocean, far from the land of your ancestors. At just 8 or 10 years old, Olivier Lejeune, an African boy, had this happen. It was 1628 and he was one of the first known enslaved Africans brought to New France. Oh, just so you know, New France is current-day Quebec. His journey wasn't just the beginning of his life in a strange land. It was also a part of the first chapters of Canadian history. Slavery, oppression, and racial injustice. These actions were integral to the formation of this country, shaping the lives of those who had no say in their fate. This honestly reminds me of the anime Erased. So, Erased is about Satoru Fujinami, a 29-year-old failed manga artist who has the ability to travel back in time a moment before disaster strikes to prevent tragic events, which he dubs revival. Without spoiling too much, the show is basically a time travel murder mystery that is masterfully done. It takes on themes of trust and betrayal, loneliness and isolation, the impact of trauma, as well as a few more themes. Okay, now for the major spoilers. If you haven't seen this show, go watch it. You've been warned. In the first episode, Satoru's mom, who is the best anime mom by the way, is murdered. He gets framed for it, and his ability kicks in and sends him back in time to 1988 when he was just a 5th grader. And in this new time, he finds out that his mom's murder is somehow linked to child kidnappings that happened in his hometown back in the day. This show had me hooked. From Satoru's revival ability, the sound design, the music, the lighting, the framing, the use of color, the foreshadowing, all just chef's kiss. My God, bro. But what really resonated with me was the character of Kayo. She was one of the children involved in the mystery, and her life is a tragic reflection of trauma and neglect. Abused by her mother, isolated from her peers, and abandoned by those who should have cared for her most, Kayo's story is full of deep pain. But at the heart of her story is something powerful: survival and resistance. Over the course of the series, Satoru helps her break free from isolation, slowly giving her the tools to trust again and resist the destructive forces in her life. Now, let's take Kayo's story and think about it through the lens of history. Much like Kayo, black people, especially enslaved Africans and indigenous people in early Canada, faced systems of control, isolation, and dehumanization. Kayo's resistance, her fight to reclaim her life, isn't just about escaping her abuser. It's about breaking free from a system that sought to define, control, and ultimately erase her from the narrative. In the same way, enslaved Africans in New France weren't just fighting for physical freedom. They were fighting for their dignity, their humanity, in a system designed to strip them of both. Like Kayo, they had to navigate a world that saw them as expendable. Their lives held little value to those in power. They were forced to find ways to preserve their humanity in the face of overwhelming odds. Whether it was just small acts of rebellion, self-preservation, or community building, enslaved people found ways to push back against a system that wanted to erase them completely. Much like Satoru, fighting against the corrupt and oppressive forces of the abductor reflects a deep struggle for survival and justice. Black people in early Canada fought against systems of oppression often unseen and unacknowledged. They had to cut the spider's web of systemic racism and slavery that held them captive. The very survival of black communities was an act of resistance. From the early enslaved Africans that were brought to New France, to those who fought for freedom and justice in a land that sought to erase their very existence. Any race, Satro's small actions, his ability to make small changes in the past, ultimately shaped a better future. Similarly, the resilience and resistance of Black communities in early Canada, though often erased or silenced in mainstream history, helped shape the country's future in profound ways. Their survival, their fight for justice and dignity, is woven into the very fabric of the nation, even if their contributions have been overlooked. Erase taps into the universal feeling of loss, redemption, and the power of small changes. By the end of the series, Satro's journey is one of healing and coming to terms with the past. The show teaches us that while we may not be able to change everything, our actions can still make a difference. Even the smallest changes can create ripples of hope in a seemingly hopeless world. And in the same way, the resilience of Black people in early Canada, small but powerful acts of survival and defiance, helped lay the groundwork for the Canada we know today. Okay, let us use revival to take us back to the historical backdrop of the 1600s. It wasn't all doom and gloom for Black people, just mostly. For example, Matthew da Costa, one of the first recorded Black people in Canada, a man who lived in New France in the early 1600s. He's a fascinating, though often overlooked figure in Canadian history. Da Costa was likely brought to New France as a free man, and he was essential to bridging the gap between French settlers and the indigenous nations of the area. He was an interpreter, and as an interpreter, Da Costa's ability to communicate and build relationships was invaluable. He could speak French, Dutch, Portuguese, English, Mi'kmaq, Pidgin Basque, and maybe some others. However, like Cayo, Da Costa faced a colonial system that saw him as both a tool and a threat. He was a Black man navigating a society that marginalized him, even though he was central to the survival of French settlers. In today's terms, you could almost think of him as a kind of consultant, someone who understood both cultures and could help them communicate and collaborate. Da Costa's ability was key. He didn't just survive in a world that wasn't built for him, he thrived, moving seamlessly between indigenous and European societies at a time when those worlds were incredibly divided. So we're gonna fast forward just a tiny bit. During the slave trade, New France was a relatively minor destination for enslaved Africans compared to regions like the Caribbean, South America, and the American colonies, where plantation economies were highly dependent on slave labor. Enslaved Africans like Olivier Lejeune were brought to New France mainly as domestic servants, farm laborers, or workers in the fur trade. Their forced labor became essential to the colony's survival. The people that were enslaved lived in a world where they were treated as property, a reality deeply embedded in the colonial system. And it was no less brutal for those who suffered compared to the British America. French and English settlers began establishing colonies, with Samuel de Champlain found in Quebec in 1608. The beginnings of Canadian history are rooted in complex interactions between Indigenous peoples and European explorers. Indigenous people were captured in wars or coerced into forced labor, often as part of the French fur trade. However, the arrival of enslaved Africans in the colony shook up the status quo. The indigenous populations were devastated by European diseases, warfare, and displacement. And because of that, the French settlers found their labor force increasingly unreliable. The growing demand for agricultural production and the expansion of land settlements required a more stable and controllable labor force. The growing demand for agricultural production and the expansion of land settlements required a more stable and controllable labor force, and enslaved Africans fit the bill. In 1628, a young African boy was brought to New France. The African boy was captured in Madagascar and transported to New France at the age of 8 or 10, where he was placed in the service of Jean de Saint-Castin, a French colonist who would then have the African boy baptized and take on the name Olivier Lejeune. This was one of the earliest enslaved Africans recorded in Canada, and his arrival is significant as it marked the beginning of the institution of African slavery in the French colony. Over time, the French brought more enslaved Africans and indigenous people to New France than in other parts of the Americas. While the overall number of enslaved Africans was limited, slavery became an increasingly integral part of the colonial economy, especially as the French sought to establish permanent settlements and expand agricultural production. Olivier's story is an important part of this broader system, representing the beginning of a small but persistent practice of slavery that would continue in New France, shaping the colony's labor system for years to come. Okay, so now we're going to look closer at the legal, social, and economic structures that allowed slavery to be sustained in New France. These structures didn't just support slavery as an institution, they actively reinforced it, embedding it deeply into the fabric of Canadian colonial society. One of the most troubling aspects of the colonial system were the laws governing slavery. They didn't just regulate the enslaved population, they created a broader social framework that justified and perpetuated their enslavement. Racism wasn't merely a personal belief, it was woven into the very fabric of colonial law and society, institutionalized to maintain control over entire groups of people. Could you imagine being in a system where even a simple act of rebellion, a small moment of defiance, could cost you everything? Your safety, your life. That was the reality under the Code Noir. So what is the Code Noir? I'm glad you asked. I will tell you. The Code Noir, or Black Code, was established by King Louis XIV in 1685. This set of laws legalized the enslavement of Africans and indigenous people in French colonies, including New France. It treated them as property, not people, and cemented their forced labor as essential to the colonial economy. The Code Noir enforced strict control over the enslaved population, with brutal punishments for any resistance or escape attempts. Anyone caught trying to rebel could face beatings, brandings, mutilation, or death. The law also imposed harsh penalties on anyone who aided runaways. This climate of fear ensured that the enslaved remained tightly controlled with little hope of escape. But slavery was also maintained through the influence of religion. The French Catholic Church was deeply connected with the colonial project. It framed slavery as part of God's divine plan. Enslaved Africans and indigenous people were forcibly converted to Catholicism. Remember Olivier? With religious leaders preaching that they were heathens in need of salvation. While enslaved people were baptized, they remained in bondage, forced to work under insufferable conditions. This religious justification helped mask the violence of slavery, painting it as a moral imperative rather than a system of exploitation. The Code Noir also outlined minimal rights for slave owners. While it required that they provide basic provisions like food, water, shelter, and clothing, these were often insufficient, and the code's protections for the enslaved were rarely enforced. Additionally, it ensured that slavery was hereditary, passing down through generations, which guaranteed the system would carry on. Slavery wasn't just an economic system, it was a moral and social one too. It was built on exploitation, control, and dehumanization, reinforced by laws, economics, and religious doctrine. Catholic priests baptized enslaved individuals, but justified their suffering by preaching that submission and obedience to their masters was part of God's plan. This created a deep moral contradiction. If enslaved people were to be saved, why were they still treated as property forced into brutal labor? These contradictions were central to the colonial system. Slavery wasn't only about keeping people in chains, it was about maintaining a social order, where inequality, racism, and exploitation were fundamental to colonial society. The structures that sustained slavery were reinforced by law, religion, and the economy, creating a system that made dehumanization seem natural and even righteous. To be honest, while reading the Code Noir, I'm not surprised at the awful punishments that were given out and the bare minimum rations enslaved people were given. It just makes me think about how can an entire society believe with their whole chest that a person is less than human, and how could people just sweep it under the rug afterwards? Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and focus on the lives of enslaved people in New France. The lived experience of those who were enslaved was shaped by many factors, including geography, gender, and the type of labor they were forced to do. While the majority of enslaved people in Canada worked in urban households or in the fur trade, many also labored on farms. Enslaved Africans and Indigenous people were tasked with cooking, cleaning, caring for children, and maintaining the homes of wealthy French and British families. Though some worked alongside free workers, they were always treated as property, never as equals. I want to focus on one person in particular when it comes to discussing the lives of enslaved people in Canada. The story of Mary Joseph Angelique is one of tragedy, injustice, and the harsh realities of slavery in early Canada. Born in Portugal, Mary Joseph was enslaved at a young age and brought to New France. In the early 1700s, likely around the age of 15 or 16, she was sold to a wealthy family in Montreal, where she worked as a domestic servant. Her life, like that of many enslaved Africans, was filled with grueling labor, racial discrimination, and the constant reminder that she was considered property, not a person. Enslaved women in colonial societies were particularly vulnerable, experiencing sexual exploitation, physical violence, and constant dehumanization. Mary Joseph and women like her were forced to work long hours and were often treated as objects for the convenience and pleasure of their masters, adding to the layers of oppression that they faced. In the case of many enslaved women, there was a near total disregard for their autonomy and humanity. Yet, despite her conditions, Mary Joseph Angelique harbored a quiet defiance, a deep, unspoken resistance to the cruelty she faced every day. So, in 1734, Mary Joseph's life would take a fateful turn. On the evening of April 10th, a massive fire erupted in Montreal, tearing through much of the colony, destroying homes, leaving hundreds of people homeless and out in the cold. The fire ravaged parts of the city, including the properties of wealthy Montreal residents. The fire was so large that it became the talk of the entire colony, and as quick as the strong winds carrying the fire spread, so did the rumors that pointed at Mary Joseph. So, naturally, in colonial New France, Mary Joseph Angelique was arrested the very next day on April 11th, based on rumors and accusations from her neighbors. Her potential sale, which was looming over her life and had caused her immense anxiety, adding to the pressure she already faced. Despite the gravity of the charges against her, no one actually witnessed Mary Joseph setting the fire. Yet, she was blamed for it, a claim that she fiercely denied. Though no real evidence could link her to the blaze, she was blamed largely because of her reputation as a rebellious and defiant slave. Angelique's trial became a spectacle of injustice. Her trial was held without her. Her trial had no lawyer for her defense. The evidence that was presented against her was he said, she said bull. The French colonial authorities had already made up their minds. The accusations alone, the possibility of an enslaved person causing so much destruction, was enough to convict her. There was no room for doubt. There was no space for a different narrative, one in which an enslaved woman might be innocent, or in which an enslaved person might hold a semblance of justice. The system was rigged in favor of her masters, and Mary Joseph Angelique, caught in the unyielding machinery of colonial rule, had no way out. What played out was a courtroom drama that was an ugly reflection of a colonial society, where the lives of enslaved people were treated with complete disregard. Angelique was accused not only of arson, but also of a form of rebellion, an act that defied the very system that kept her in chains. For the authorities, this was no mere crime. It was an affront to their power, an act of resistance that had to be punished severely. And so, despite the lack of concrete evidence, Mary Joseph Angelique was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. The final sentence, carried out on June 21st, 1734. Angelique was tortured using the brodequin. It's a medieval torture device that crushed her legs to extract a confession. She was then taken through the streets of Montreal to Notre Dame Basilica, where she made a public confession and begged for forgiveness. Mary Joseph Angelique was then hung until strangled. Her body was then burned to ashes and spread with the wind. The sentence was a brutal and public reminder of the unrelenting control that slave owners and colonial authorities had over enslaved people. It wasn't enough that her life was taken. Her execution was a spectacular public display designed to instill fear in others who might dare to defy the system. Today, Mary Joseph Angelique's story lives on as a powerful reminder of the devastating consequences of slavery in Canada. Her trial and execution exposed the deep moral contradiction in a colonial system that claimed to be Christian and yet engaged in brutal exploitation and dehumanization of people based on race and class. Her name, though long forgotten in much of Canadian history, serves as a testament to countless enslaved individuals who suffered in silence, whose stories were lost, and whose voices were silenced by overwhelming power and colonialism. Aside from the fire, Angelique's life was not unique. It shines a light into the broader realities that enslaved Africans and indigenous people in New France faced. In Canada, as in the States, it's clear that these systems of oppression didn't just disappear with the abolition of slavery. The same structures of inequality, exploitation, and racism that upheld slavery continue to shape modern Canadian society. After all my years of research, understanding this history is essential if we are to fully confront and address the ongoing impact today. So, fast forward to today, Black Canadians still face significant barriers in areas such as education, employment, housing, and healthcare. In both Erased and the Story of Black History in Canada, there's a shared focus on changing the future by confronting the past, overcoming injustice, and healing from trauma. The personal battles faced by characters in Erased resonate with the collective struggles of Black Canadians who fought against enslavement and discrimination. Ultimately, both narratives remind us that history is not a static force. It's shaped by actions we take today to address the injustices of the past. So, key takeaways. First, the story of Black people in early Canada is not one that's often told, but it is essential to understand. The struggles against enslavement and oppression are deeply tied to the story of the country itself. Slavery was deeply embedded in early Canadian society, period, full stop. Enslaved Africans and indigenous people were crucial to the colonial economy, working as domestic servants, farm laborers, and in the fur trade. The Cold War legalized slavery and treated enslaved people as property, with religious justification reinforcing their dehumanization. Third, the systems that sustained slavery, laws, religion, and economic structures didn't just disappear with abolition. The legacy of racism and inequality continues to affect Black and Indigenous Canadians today, manifesting in areas like education, housing, and the justice system as struggles for racial justice persist. Finally, Erased is a damn good show and you should go watch it. Alright, I hope you learned something. Please like, share, and follow the podcast for more anime-infused history. Until next time, peace.